And so tonight we're going to be continuing on through the book of Genesis. And the title for this lesson is The Promise Continues, because here we're going to see a transition. And really tonight we're going to be talking about 3 generations of patriarchs. We're going to be talking about Abraham, Isaac, and of course Jacob and Esau, if you want to throw him in there. But it's going to be the only time that we're going to look at all 3 generations, if you will, during this reading because of what takes place in chapter 25. And of course I'm talking about Abraham's death. And so Abraham, the patriarch, the one that we've been reading about for the last several weeks, is going to meet his demise, if you will. And so if you want to, let's go ahead and let's read the death of Abraham in Genesis 25, and we'll start in verse 1. And Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah, and she bore to him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuha. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Let-Ushim, and Leuman. Sorry. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Henoch, Abida, and Eldaah. And they were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the hill country. And these are the days and the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last, and he died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zoar the Hittite, east of Mamre, in the field that Abraham had purchased from the Hittites. And there Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. And after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Laharoi. And so here we have Abraham dies. And how old is Abraham when he dies? 175. So how old is Isaac when his father Abraham dies? 75, right? Pretty easy math because Abraham's 100 when Isaac is born. How old is Ishmael when Abraham dies? A little bit more hard to figure out, but we can ballpark it. He's about somewhere between 87 and about 95. Somewhere in that range. And so, good. And so both men are fairly aged themselves. Of course, Isaac's got a lot of life left in him, and Ishmael's got about 35 years left in him. And so Abraham's buried at the age of 175. He's buried by Ishmael and Isaac. It's interesting that these other 6 sons are not mentioned. And so he's not buried by all of his sons, but just Ishmael and Isaac. And of course, those are the 2 that we know most about. And so Abraham had 8 sons by the time that he died. Oftentimes we only think about Isaac, and sometimes people think of Isaac and Ishmael. Some people are actually really surprised when they find out that Abraham actually had 6 additional sons. And so...
Did he not have more than that? It says the sons of his concubines. So it's called Keturah his wife.
Yeah, that's the question. The question is whether or not Keturah is the one that's mentioned with concubines, or if he had other women in his life who fathered... Yeah, more sons. Yeah, people are divided on whether or not the concubine is talking about Keturah or somebody else. We know he had at least 6, and if the concubines are talking about additional women, which is very plausible it is, then there's probably additional sons. Yeah, it could be. It could be referring to both of them, and they're seen to have less status of Sarah, his wife. And so it's kind of divided over whether the concubines refers to Hagar and Keturah, or whether they, the argument is, why aren't they named like Keturah is and Hagar? Now, we know one of the reasons why is because by this time Isaac has already been established as a son of promise, where we have the narrative of Ishmael is kind of up in the air, right? Abraham wants Ishmael to be their heir. God says no, and so we understand why he's mentioned. These are mentioned there pretty much during his death narrative, and so it's a good question. It's a good question. We know he had at least 6, maybe more. So, Brother Ricky?
Do we know how old Abraham was when he took the sacrifice?
We don't. We don't. It doesn't say. It doesn't give the narrative of when that took place, or how old the sons were. I'm sorry?
We don't have any idea how old you may have been.
No. Mm-mm. So, Good questions.
Sarah died at 127, so he was older than that.
Yeah. If he married her after Sarah's death, which most likely took place. So 137, if Sarah died at 127, 10 years older than she was. And so probably within the last 40 years of his life, give or take. And so probably the most likely.
Had she been a concubine, he could have had some of those sons before.
Exactly. And so that's the question, right? That's kind of the question. And like I said before, wife is not a Hebrew word. It's just woman, right? So it could be Abraham took for him a woman, Keturah. She bore him 6 sons. And so sometimes context kind of determines who's who in that situation. Good questions and good comments. Out of these 6 sons that are born to Abraham, Midian and his descendants are going to play the most important role in the rest of the biblical literature. About half these sons are going to be mentioned again, but Midian is the one. Midianite traders are going to be the one that's going to take Joseph down into Egypt. The Midianites are going to be where Moses is going to find a wife. He takes Jethro's daughter. And then the Midianites are going to be a nation that actually wars against Israel as they're trying to take the promised land. They're going to align themselves with Edom. And then, of course, we're reading the book of Judges, and the Midianites are the ones who are oppressing the land. During the book, one of the nations oppressing the land, Gideon actually is the one that fights against the Midianites. And they're in Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8. And so Midian plays an important role, but an antagonistic role to Israel, as will most of the nations that come from Abraham, Lot, and Esau. And so he's buried by Ishmael and Isaac at Machpelah with Sarah. It's close to Hebron. Here it's called Mamre, but it's going to be close to Hebron. We talked about this several times throughout Genesis. We won't rehash much of this, but that's going to be where King David is going to be crowned. That's where he's going to rule as king for 7 years before he conquers Jerusalem from the Jebusites and moves the capital there. And then that becomes the city for the Israelites, and then the tribe of Judah later on after the split. And so Isaac gets everything, right? Which, if you're named Isaac, it's pretty good for you, right? But just like Ishmael in Genesis chapter 21, these men get gifts, right? They're sent out. They're not sent out with nothing, right? They're sent out with gifts, which is probably monetary things, gifts. But when Abraham dies, the wealth, the sheep, the wells, that all gets passed down to the son of promise, and of course that's going to be Isaac.
Isaac, I know it don't tell us, but by custom or tradition, do we know how old they were likely when they were sent out?
We don't. And so some even suppose that some of it's just a guessing game. Some say all these sons were born after Isaac and were younger. Some people argue that he married Keturah and had some of these sons in between Ishmael and Isaac.
No, I'm saying what age those sons were when he sent out.
Oh, we do know about Ishmael. He's the only one. Ishmael is sent out when he's about 17. And so he's a young man. He's not an old man. But as far as the sons of Keturah, we don't know. But that may help us understand when these sons get sent out. Maybe early manhood. We know which direction they went, but we don't know much else about that. It's a good question, though. Good question. All right. And so does Abraham die? Okay, here's a map we can see here. Hebron is going to be where Machpelah is, where the cave is. That's going to be where Abraham and Sarah are going to be buried. And then Isaac is going to go down south towards Beersheba. And so then we get to the birth of Esau and Jacob. I shouldn't say that. Okay. Was Abraham alive or dead when Esau and Jacob were born? Miss Julia, it is clearly like 10 verses after he dies.
I don't care.
So you're doing math, Miss Julia? Good. You're right, Miss Julia. I was just messing with you. I knew you would correct me. And so Miss Julia is right, as always. Rebecca was barren for 20 years, right? So Isaac marries Rebecca when she's 40. She's barren for 20 years. Interestingly enough, how long was Sarah barren? Well, it depends on when you start counting, right? If you start counting when she's 20, then or 15, But when we're introduced to Sarah and she's promised a son, how long is she barren? 25 years, right? She's barren from the time that she's 65 to the time that she's 90. She's given the promise when Abraham is 75 and she's 65. She has Isaac when she's 90, 25 years. Now, that covers 8 chapters, and Rebekah's covers 1 verse, right? Just says that she was barren and that Isaac prayed to God that he would open up her womb. Now, let's go ahead, let's just read verses 19 through 28, if you don't mind. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, and the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, and to his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and 2 people will be divided from you. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." And when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all over his body, hairy like a cloak, and they called his name Esau. Afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. And when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so here we're told that he was 40 when she married her. He was 60 when she had his sons. She was barren. She was barren for 20 years. That means Isaac was 60 years old. Abraham's exactly 100 years older than Isaac, which means Abraham was 160. Miss Julia is correct. Abraham was alive when these boys were born. In fact, we know exactly how old Abraham was when they were born, and we know exactly how old they were when Abraham died. How old were Esau and Jacob when their grandfather died? 15, right? And so not only do we know if they were alive, we know how old they were and how old Abraham was. How old they were when Abraham died. And so, just having a son a few weeks ago, I can kind of sympathize. I can't sympathize. Brittany can empathize with Rebekah. She's got this, tussling going on inside of her, and she's obviously never had children before, and she's like, what is going on inside my womb? Like, what is happening? And so she asks God, what is all this commotion that I can feel inside of me? He says, you got twins, right? You got 2 people inside your womb, and they're going to be fighters their entire life. And he talks about how Esau is hairy. The name Esau means hairy. And so I talked about this when we talked about the sermon on Esau. There's a condition called lanugo, which is when babies are born and they're hairy. All babies in the womb are covered in hair. But sometime between weeks 32 and 36, the hair mostly dissolves into the amniotic fluid that they're in. But sometimes, occasionally, babies are born and they still have that hairiness on them. I know when Emmett was born, you could kind of see some hair on the shoulders. Not a whole lot, but just a little bit. And so Jacob is called cheater or supplanter because as Esau's coming out, Jacob is holding his heel. And of course, he's going to be Rebekah's favorite. And here you can see a baby with a head full of red hair. And so that's probably what Esau looked like with the red hair. Maybe. He had red hair and he was hairy. So I don't know. There was a baby that had like a hair like Elvis, and I was like, that would be a good one to show too. But it was black, and so it didn't work. It didn't work for us. But Esau was a skillful hunter, and so he spent most of his time hunting game. Very wealthy family, so they didn't have to really labor as day laborers would or slaves would. And but the word used for Esau, where it says he dwelled in tents, and it means he was probably a little bit more intellectual, more refined than Esau was. And so there's something that takes place that these 2 men are famous for, especially Esau, and that is Esau was going to sell his birthright for a cup of stew. And so let's read verses 29 through 34 and see what takes place. It's going to change their lives forever. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom. And Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. Esau said, I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Jacob said, swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. And Esau despised his birthright. And so here we see that Esau comes in from the field and he's hungry, and there's some red stew. And so the moniker, the name Edom, comes from this, because the Hebrew word that sounds like Edom means red. And so it was known as, his name was Esau, which meant hairy, but his nickname evidently was Edom, which means red. And so maybe you went to school with somebody who was red-haired and you called them Big Red or Red, or I don't know. Still a common nickname for someone with red hair. And so Jacob exchanges his birthright. He says, I'm hungry. Give me something to eat. Now, was Esau really going to die?
No, he just felt like it, like I do sometimes.
Sometimes you just feel that way, huh, Miss Joy?
Yeah, this morning.
Because you were hungry, or just...
I was hungry. I didn't eat before I went in.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's always a shame when they say don't eat for 8 hours. And you're like, what? That's why, never mind. Yes. I have a newborn at home, and I'm sleep deprived, guys. I'm sorry. My mind is just like all over the place. That's right. We don't know what stage of death he was at, do we? We don't know if he was just a little hungry because it had been, 8 o'clock that morning since he ate, or if he'd been out on a hunting trip, and we have no idea how close to death he was. Doesn't seem like it was that close from what we read, but we're not there, so maybe we'll give Esau a little bit of credit, but after we read a little bit more about Esau, we probably won't. But what was a birthright in the ancient world? What was it?
The firstborn was given a bigger portion of his father's.
That's right. He was given a bigger portion. And did we know what size that portion was? A double portion, right? And so we've got the Dartys and the Smiths, right? And so Brother Ed, you're the oldest of 9. Okay. And so when Brother Ed's parents would have been deceased, they would have taken their fortunes, their multi-millions of dollars they had. Right, Brother Ed?
Sure.
He's like, if we're making this story up, why not, right? They would have taken those assets and they would have divided them 10 ways. Now, they had 9 kids. Why would they divide them 10 ways?
The first one got 2.
That's right. Who's the oldest?
Ed.
That one time it works out in your favor, right, Brother Ed? And so if you have 9 children and it's split 10 ways, is the double portion that much more? No. But what if there's 2 kids? Now it's 66-33, right? I mean, Brother Ricky?
It actually worked out better for me. I was the youngest, and they always gave me Christmas presents until I graduated high school.
Oh, so you had all the older brothers and sisters giving you, right?
Another thing, they with the whippings we got.
They were tired, right? They were tired by the time Ricky came around, right? But yeah, so the larger the family, there's some benefits there. Smaller the family, there's some benefits there. But in the ancient world, if you had 2 kids, right, and there was a double portion there, that kind of stung a little bit, right? I mean, if there's 9 of you, you get like what? You get 9% more than the rest of everybody else. But I mean, if there's 2 right there, it's 66-33. That hurts if your brother's a couple years older than you. If your brother's 3 seconds older than you, and he gets double what you get, that stings a whole lot, right? And so this seems to have been something that Jacob never forgot, never let out of his sights, always was looking for an opportunity maybe to capitalize on or to switch. And so here when Jacob says, give me some of your red stew, immediately he thinks, okay, this is where I tip the scales in my favor. This is where I get, 66-33. Remember, is Isaac a rich guy? Yeah, he's super rich, right? So, I mean, this ain't 66% of $100, right? I mean, this is 66% of a whole lot of money. And so, very important. Any questions or comments, Miss Susan?
I thought Jacob's mother kind of put that idea in his head to try to get the birthright.
Well, here Esau sells him the birthright. A little bit later on, we're going to see Rebekah hatch a plan for that to come through. And we can really beat up on Rebekah, right? And maybe we can. I don't know. When I was a kid, I used to beat up on Rebekah because she was my sister. And Mom always said, you better quit that because he's going to be bigger than you one day, right? And then when I did, Dad was like, don't you hit her. And so it never came to fruition. Which, anyways. But did Rebekah have a divine revelation telling her that the younger son was going to serve or be master over the older brother? She did, right? And so she knew from God. So we could look at Rebekah, which I'm not saying that the whole like little fib and line thing was the right way to go about it. I'm not saying that. But she did know from God himself that Jacob was special and that Jacob was going to be the one whom the promise was going to go through. And so she did have some divine insight on that. Now, she might not have went by the appropriate way with the deception of Isaac, but she did have some inside knowledge there for that. And so Esau has apathy, right? One of the worst things a Christian can have is apathy, right? They just don't care. The Bible tells us in Colossians chapter 3 that we should do all things as we're doing them for who? For the Lord and not man, right? And so apathy does not look good on a Christian. Whether it's at the job site, whether it's at school, in class, Christians should not have C's get degrees mentality, right? We're working for the Lord, right? Christians shouldn't have we'll work while the boss is looking, then we'll slow step when he's not here. Like that type of apathy towards our work or our responsibilities is not what a Christian is supposed to have. And yet when you look at Esau, he has apathy. He has apathy towards his birthright. He has apathy towards his heritage. That's when it says Esau went away. He despised his birthright. The real modern word we use is contempt, right? If you don't show somebody the proper respect in court, what do they call that? Contempt of court, right? You're not showing the due respect. You should be given that authority. Here, Esau does not see his birthright. He's only thinking about it in a material sense, but not a spiritual sense, the importance of his birthright. And so Esau is going to do this again and again throughout the narrative of Esau. It's not just his birthright, which he is apathetic towards. There's also other things. And so then we have the promise given to Isaac. And so let's look at verses 1 through 5 of chapter 26. Verses 1 through 5. Now there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall show you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and I will give your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, and he kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And so here, Isaac is in the midst of a famine. Now, if you look at chapter 26, it reads extremely similar to some of the main points in Abraham's life that we read about in the chapters previously in the book of Genesis. Was Abraham ever in the midst of a famine? Yes. And what did Abraham do? He went to Egypt. Now there's a famine in the land, and maybe Isaac's thinking about going to Egypt. We're not told. But God preemptively goes to Isaac and tells him what? You stay here, right? Now, ironically, is Abraham told by God to go to Egypt? He's not, is he? And so he goes to Egypt. That's where he acquires Hagar when the Pharaoh gives him a lot of stuff. That causes Ishmael to be born, problems with Sarah. And so, Abraham might not should have went to Egypt himself. But here God preemptively tells him, do not leave the land of promise. Which is interesting because when they go to get Rebekah, his wife, what does Abraham not want Isaac to do? Leave the land, right? He says, no matter what happens, Isaac can't leave. And now God is doing the same thing. He says, you can't leave. And as far as we know, Isaac never leaves the promised land. And so Abraham did, Jacob did, Esau did, Jacob and all the sons, Joseph and all the sons did. Isaac's the only patriarch that we know of that never left, right? Because when they go down into Egypt, That's 15 years before Isaac's born. And so he's not with Abraham when he goes down into Egypt. And so it's just an interesting thing to see there. And so God promises to establish Isaac and bless him as he did to his father Abraham. And notice that God highlights Abraham's faithfulness to his laws and his statutes and his commands. And so even the patriarchs themselves were just as subject to faith through obedience as we are today, albeit they had it in a different way and different commands and laws, running the law of Christ, and they were under the patriarchal law, but they still had a responsibility to God to act obediently through their faith. And so we can see from Genesis chapter 2 with Adam and Eve all the way to the end of Revelation that God's expectation of man has not changed. To be faithful to him in obedience, right? The expectation has not changed. The laws have changed, but not the expectation of what mankind is to do. And so any questions on verses 1 through 5 of Genesis 26? This is where it gets really interesting in verses 6 through 35, basically the rest of the chapter. And for time's sake, we will not read that, but we'll give some highlights. Isaac goes to Gerar, which is going to be kind of the capital city of Abimelech. Abimelech, it means my king. That is the name of the Philistine kings. And so Abraham goes to Gerar. He meets Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. He goes there, and what does Abraham do with Sarah? Yeah, he says, "This is my sister," right? And Abimelech does what?
Isaac does the same thing.
That's right. Isaac goes to Gerar. He sees Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And what does Isaac say? "This is Rebekah. She is my sister." Now, Abraham explained himself. He was like, "Well, she's technically my half-sister, right?" You know, and but Isaac's, he just flat out lies, to be honest with you. And so there are some differences in this motif in that in Abraham, what does Abimelech do to Sarah? Right, takes her, right? Doesn't marry her like Pharaoh does, but he takes her. And then God strikes Abimelech's house. Here, does Abimelech take Rebekah? No, nobody takes Rebekah, thankfully. But he sees Isaacing, right? Isaac's name means what? Laughter. He sees Isaac laughing with Rebekah, and he says, "This is your wife." Which makes you kind of wonder what the whole thing was about, right? And he says, "This is your wife." And says, "Why would you lie to me like that?" And he says, I'm sorry, I was afraid." And so, but just like Abraham, he does this. Abimelech says, you shouldn't do this. But he gives protection to Isaac. He says, nobody is to touch Rebekah or Isaac. Isaac stays there, and then God richly blesses him, and he becomes incredibly rich, the text tells us. And the Philistines who are there become jealous because this foreigner has come in among them, and not only is he living among them, but he's getting returns on his flocks that are just ridiculous. Right? It's not fair. It's like you guys have got the same, financial planner, and you're getting 8% back on your retirement fund, and your buddy's getting 21%. And you got the same financial planner, and you're like, "What? This is not fair," right? And so the Philistines get upset about Isaac because he's there amongst their midst, and his flock's just too fantastic, just like Jacob's are going to do when he's over with his uncle Laban. And so they get upset. They ask him to go away. So Isaac goes away, and the Philistines are not big fans of Abraham or Isaac. They go to the wells that Abraham dug. They've already smashed them in. Isaac has to redig the wells. When he redigs the wells, the Philistines come out and say, "Oh, those are our wells." And so Isaac goes to another place and he redigs a well that Abraham had. And they say, "Oh, no, that's our well too." And so Isaac's non-confrontational, and so he goes and he eventually builds a well, and he calls it kind of broad. The name means there's room. And so he gets kind of out of the side of where the Philistines are to himself. And when he does this, Abimelech comes out to him and asks to have a treaty with Isaac. Now, why is this ironic? What did Abimelech do with Abraham? Anybody remember? Yeah, Abimelech came out with his general and said, "Hey, I want to have a treaty. I can tell that God loves you and He's blessing you, and any friend of God's is a friend of mine, and I want to have you on my team. And so they make a treaty. Anybody know where that treaty's made?
Is that a will?
Yeah, Beersheba, right? And so here, years later, Abimelech takes his general, and one of his advisors this time, but he goes to Isaac and he makes a covenant with him and says, I can tell that God has blessed you and I want to have a treaty with you. And they make a covenant or an oath. And guess where they make it at? Beersheba, right? And so here you have, you look at this in the story of Abraham and Isaac, and it's extremely, extremely similar to what takes place with Abimelech in Genesis chapter 22, almost eerily. So there's some differences, like here, it's not just Abimelech and the general. Here it's Abimelech, the general, and also one of his advisors, but it's extremely similar. And so here at the very end, let's look at the last few verses. We don't have to look at that because of time's sake. But what does Esau do? He marries foreign women. How many? 2. And what does it say about Isaac and Rebekah? Right, they made life bitter for them. Right, they didn't like it. And so was there an emphasis placed on marrying within inside the bloodlines? Yeah, that's exactly, Abraham said he didn't want Isaac to marry any of the local ladies, and so he sends his servant back to Haran to marry somebody within the bloodline, right? And so these men have probably been, Esau and Jacob, they're grown men. And so they've been told growing up, this is how we do things in this family. We're different. Now, we're sojourners here, but this land has been promised to us and our descendants, but we're not like everybody else. We don't worship the gods they do. We don't marry into these people. Like, we're a special people chosen by God. Did Esau respect his birthright? No. Did Esau respect the fact that he wasn't supposed to marry outside the bloodlines? No. And so Esau is that child that rolls their eyes and makes you mad because they just don't care, right? It's like, honey, why do you do better on your test? I don't know. It's like, honey, why do you have awful friends? Well, I don't know. Why do you make awful choices in life? Well, I don't know. It's just like, you just want to smack them, right? Because, it's like, have more concern about your life. That's Esau. Even Isaac had one of those. And so he's apathetic. He just doesn't care. And everything he can do that seems to be a thorn in his parents' side, he does do. Now he tries to amend the process a little bit later by doing what? The next chapter. Am I read ahead? Isaac and Rebekah get real upset. He's married a foreign woman, and he goes and he marries a daughter of Ishmael, right? Tries to get back in the family. Too little, too late, right? And so he's already kind of made his bed and what he's going to get. And so here's a map that you can see a lot of these places we've been talking about. There is Beersheba, which is where the treaty is going to be at. Mamre and Hebron, Machpelah, that's where Abraham and Sarah were buried. Gerar, that's going to be the capital of Abimelech and the Philistines. Later on, when we see about 450 years from now, when they go back into the land, the Philistines have grown, and now instead of one king of the Philistines, they have 5 major cities and 5 kings. And so that changes a little bit in about 450 years. But at this time, the Philistines are smaller and they just have one major city and one king. And so that's a difference that sometimes confuses people, but that's what's taking place here. Any questions or comments? No? 3 quick takeaways. God's promise endures from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob all the way through, even till today. Galatians 3:27 tells us that when God made the promise to Abraham that he was going to bless his offspring, Galatians 3:27 tells us that we are still the recipients of that promise. It says whenever we are clothed in Christ through baptism, that we become the descendants of Abraham. And so God is still fulfilling his promise even today, and you and I are the descendants. And so when we talk about the descendants of Abraham, it's not just Isaac or Jacob or Joseph, it's you. And so you are the spiritual descendant of Abraham. Number 2, faith necessitates obedience. And so we can see that in the lives of the patriarchs, and of course also in New Testament teaching. And number 3, the danger of apathy. And we can make fun of Esau, but man, I've seen a bunch of Christians in my life who have the exact same attitude. right? You know, should we do this in worship or not? Does it matter? Who cares, right? You know, like, should we be concerned about our image with others? Whatever. You know, that's their problem. It's like, you know, apathetic Christianity is not Christianity, right? The Bible tells us that we should be concerned about our image before God and also before man, that we should care. Colossians 3, that we should work for man as if it was the Lord. We're not apathetic people. We're people who take pride and who take care in living our lives for God. And I'm afraid sometimes that it's for all of us, even myself, that sometimes we can be lured into this danger of apathetic living as a Christian, which is, we don't need to be doing that. Thank you so much for your comments and your questions. Anybody have a comment, Brother Ed?
Don't the Muslims claim that Abraham is also their father?
They do. They claim they're descendants of Ishmael. There's contention as to whether or not they actually do come from Ishmael. Ishmael's descendants go down into the Saudi Arabian peninsula. That's where they're going to be. And so by necessity, many of those people who are descended from Ishmael who are alive today are probably of the Islamic faith. But but not all Muslims can trace their lineage back to Abraham. Good question. Anyone else? No? Thank you so much for your comments and your questions, and we'll go ahead and we'll close the prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for all the many blessings you've given us. We're thankful for the blessing of being spiritual descendants of the blessing that you promised to Abraham so many years ago. Dear Heavenly Father, we hope and pray that we have dedicated our lives in service to you and not to live in a way that is apathetic towards you or towards your laws or your teachings, but that we will diligently and humbly try to live our lives in such a way that honors you and brings glory to you in everything that we do, whether it's from grades in school to our competition and attitude on athletic fields, or the way that we go to work each and every day. We hope that what we do and say brings honor to you and to your name. And dear Heavenly Father, as we strive to bring honor and glory to you, please help us to look to those who are lost in sin and extend the invitation to them that they too can be spiritual descendants of Abraham and heirs according to that promise. Please help us to live our lives in such a way that does those things. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.